With me on Hokie Talk today from Closing the Gap, I have three people here with me. Closing the Gap is a club that holds open discussions amongst the VT community on a variety of social issues. So if everyone wants to introduce themselves real quick.
Hi, my name is Sam Benedetti. I'm a junior at Virginia Tech studying material science. I work with the discussion team for Closing the Gap.
My name is Seli Gebreyesus. I'm a junior at Virginia Tech. I study international public policy, and I help the special events team.
My name is Andrew Kuria. I'm a freshman here at Tech. In general engineering, want to do civil, and I do the videos for the marketing team.
Cool. So thanks all for joining me today and being here today. So I think the first thing we wanted to talk about was Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan has his podcast. There's a whole controversy about him pretty recently. And he was sort of canceled, and we can talk about cancel culture too, I guess, something like that.
Yeah.
Sort of, I guess, our thoughts on whether he deserved to be canceled or not is where we can start.
Sure. I mean, I thought it was relevant because you guys hold a podcast. I remember seeing, because I know Joe Rogan usually has on, I followed him for a while. I know he has wacky characters.
Yeah, he does.
He's got Eddie Bravo's saying Area 51 and stuff.
Well, he says he likes to have people with exactly.
Yeah,
so that
exactly.
makes it more interesting.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
But he tries to keep it as true as possible.
I think he tries to
as
keep
informative
it.
as possible.
Yeah.
He's like,
yeah.
in his apology video, he's like, I'm only one man, so he's like, there's so much I can do.
Okay, you can go.
I mean, he likes to, like you said, he likes to invite very unique people onto his podcast, but I think that's one of the things that makes him so popular is that he isn't afraid to invite anybody and everybody on with differing opinions, and with that can lead to a lot of controversial stuff. And I know very little about Joe Rogan, but I do know recently it seems like he's been a really good guy, and it seems like the allegations that are coming out against him are really old news type stuff. And I think we were talking about this before, it's people can change. So if he did end up saying the N-word with malicious intent, it maybe things have changed about him. So
okay, so I feel like I kind of agree with you guys a little bit, but Joe Rogan specifically, to me at least, this situation right now is him spreading misinformation, and then people being upset that Spotify is still hosting his podcast.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a complex problem, and I think social media sometimes kind of targets the person rather than the issue that's starting this conversation to begin with. I've heard clips of his podcast, who hasn't, and I had no problem with it, because I think even though I might not disagree with who he has on, I might disagree with who he has on and what they're saying, I think that it's not my position, nor should it be anybody's position, to take people off when you're disagreeing with what they're saying. However, I think in his tone and his mannerisms and the way that he speaks, especially when it comes to COVID information these past couple of months, he speaks as if it's factual. Yeah. And when people disagree with him or they make comments about it not being true, he will say on his podcast, no, it is, or because I said so, or because whatever. And that I think is harmful, especially when you're talking about something that requires scientific research like COVID does. And I think that even though I disagree with him, and I do think that not only should he have an apology, I think that there needs to be a change in the way that he's spreading out information, because unfortunately he knows his target audience, and he knows the repercussions that are coming out of that, what he's saying to that audience. I think that we live in a country with free speech, and I think that if you're upset at Spotify for keeping him on, then it's your civic responsibility not to listen to Spotify. Or what artists are doing, they're okay, well, I don't want to stream my music on Spotify. That's completely valid. How you criticize somebody else is up to you. But I do think that people wanting I don't know if it's legal ramifications or some kind of rule or law that prohibits quote unquote people like him to have platforms. Now you're kind of inching into free speech, and that I disagree with. Yeah.
Well, the problem with him is that he has such a huge audience and such a huge influence on the whole country. I think it's mostly U.S. based.
Yeah.
And when he's talking about things so factually, it can lead to. But it's a similar thing with Donald Trump. He has free speech and entitled to say what he wants, but it's his responsibility at the same time to to do what's best for our country and be honest. So I don't know. I think there's two big things he's like been questioned for. And it was like back to back. The first one was saying the N-word. It was like a couple of times when he was younger. I'd say like 5-10 years ago at least. It was always in context of a certain discussion or situation. It was never meant with any malicious intent. It was sort of to describe whatever situation they were talking about. And then the other situation was COVID and misinformation. And a lot of it, not to completely defend Joe Rogan, but a lot of it seems like they're sort of nitpicking at small things that they want to, that they just want to like take him down for. For example, I was watching this video of one doctor he had on, and they were saying at the time that they recorded the podcast, this one thing about, it was like in probably November, COVID was not as spreadable, as transmissible when you were vaccinated, and they were talking about that. Yeah. And then Omicron surged like crazy around December, and the stats for that kind of changed, and even if you were vaccinated, you could get COVID. And so people sort of backlashed at the podcast for that because it was released in December when Omicron was surging, but was recorded a bit earlier. So it's just stuff like that.
What did he say in the podcast?
In the podcast, they were arguing, him and whatever doctor he had on.
The doctor, right?
Yeah, whatever doctor he had on. They were saying that as long as you're vaccinated, you shouldn't get COVID. Okay. It was something along the lines of that.
Was that the doctor that he was criticized for giving a platform?
Yeah.
Was that the same?
There were like 2 or 3 doctors, but it was,
Because I remember
he brought on like questionable or unique doctors.
He brought on a doctor who was definitely not mainstream and definitely was, I think he was saying...
It wasn't like a Fauci or anything.
No, definitely wasn't a Fauci. It was, I forget his name, but he was saying like, he was pushing ivermectin, I think. And I think that's I mean, when did, I think Donald Trump started talking about ivermectin, like right when COVID started, talking about malaria drugs. They're saying, this will cure COVID, you won't get it, it'll treat it. And I don't know if there was any, I did research and I did see that like some countries like Turkey said, and if you look at like Turkey's prescription for COVID, they do treat it with ivermectin and other drugs. But I mean, what does that mean? It's legitimate? I don't know, but
or even the best way.
Or even the best way. Yeah,
I got you.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the thing you said about having a podcast like recorded earlier, but then releasing it. If that information changed, I still think that it's his and his team's responsibility to always be cautious of things like that. Because again, like, I know for Closing the Gap, we fact check, but even when we mess up and somebody catches it, we're correcting it to 30 people. He's correcting it to millions and millions and millions of people. And it'd be one thing, I think, if we were having conversations about like racism in this country and someone said a wrong statistic, because someone would just be having misinformation.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about pharmaceutical drugs, you're prescribing solutions to something like COVID, I think like if that's what you and your team are deciding, okay, we're going to talk about this, then it's completely your responsibility to make sure that you're doing the work afterwards. And I think it's easy for, like, not easy, but I think it's some of his supporters are kind of dilute the fact that he comes off as like an everyday kind of person. I think that's what he does so well, especially like Donald Trump kind of does the same thing where he's like one of us. He's not. His team has millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's not just him going into a mic and speaking like we are right now. You're talking about a full production team that has, like, they know who they're bringing on. They know what's going on. I guarantee you they have, like, continuous research that's being provided for them. And I think again, I don't think that we should be talking about necessarily, like, never letting him speak again. But I think it is right to criticize him and his team's I guess like carelessness when it comes to.
Well, why is he? Yeah.
I just have one thing to say. Like, so now do we decide? Should he be allowed to bring on anybody and everybody onto the podcast when it can potentially spread misinformation, like with very controversial people or people who just don't have the proper knowledge in certain cases, and that would like decrease his, like his whole shtick is that he brings on anybody left, right, you know, up, down, all types of people.
Because then you're like messing with his free speech and his rights to bring up whoever he wants.
Should he be also held accountable for the people that are on the podcast and what they say?
I think so. I think he should be held accountable for sure for who he brings on. And if we are saying that he has this huge team that helps back him up, I guess another question is if he knows that something is like if the news changes from one month to the next and he still releases a podcast, if he knows, why is he doing it? Is he doing it for like ratings?
But also I think, not that I'm defending him, but I think that starts an even bigger conversation within our generation where you're upset at him for bringing on those doctors and them saying, but it takes a simple Google search to research that doctor's name and their credentials. Because we don't have a system in place where you can like dictate how good of a doctor is. Like obviously, you know, depending on what research they've done and how many years they've been, you can come to a educated guess on how much you should listen to them. Yeah. But I don't think, even if he knows that doctor is not the best doctor or whatever that is, which again is subjective, and he brings it on, like, either there needs to be a system in place where we're dictating what doctors can and cannot talk about things like COVID, but that's up to us. Like I think he knows what he's doing, and again, there's a specific audience that is being targeted, but to say that we need to punish him for bringing on doctors that we may not agree with or disagree with, they have a PhD, they're a doctor, you know what I'm saying? Like, are we saying, okay, then should there be a rule that no doctor that isn't, what's the doctors that deal with viruses or scientists that deal with viruses?
Immunologists.
So whatever that is, like, are we saying that only they can speak on it? Like, there's a lot of questions. I think he's a scapegoat for a bigger problem.
Like, they don't, like, with COVID, at least as an example, and a lot of viruses in general, it's always forever changing. You know, it's always, no one ever knows for sure. It's just based on research and usually trials of maybe 500 or 50,000 people, but even then, it's not like an accurate representation of the whole world. So yeah, it's hard to say.
I think it's Andrew. I think it's important to. I think he got in trouble because he was criticizing the way we were responding to the virus. I think that's important for people to be able to say, I don't think this is working. I think we're doing this wrong. Even if it goes against science, I still think it's important to say that. But if you do come out and say vaccines don't work, I think there's a difference there between criticizing and just saying something that has not been proven.
So where do we draw the limit between freedom of speech and how do I say this? Like accountability.
I think I have the answer for you. Yeah. I think where we draw the limit is it depends on your role. I think if you're involved in government and have a role like that, you should be held a lot more accountable for what you say.
Sure.
I guess my question is, if Joe Rogan had 10 followers or 10 listeners, would we care that he's talking about any of this?
No.
Like if on this podcast right now we were talking about whatever false information we wanted to, I don't think anyone would really care.
No.
So
I think that leads to the bigger question of social media and platforms. Yeah, when should people be held accountability? Like when they get 1 million listeners
after a certain number.
After a certain number, like all that stuff. So like, it's really hard to tell exactly when accountability should be held and who can say what, when, where.
It's unrealistic to hold it to like everybody. You can't ask every person.
I think it is a good question to ask, but Joe Rogan specifically, and a lot of people that get canceled in general, to be canceled is for the majority of society, or I guess whatever group supported you originally, to not support you anymore because of an action. And I think, again, on social media, obviously these things are getting conflated, but society's personal decision, right, to not listen to him is one thing. And I think it becomes a bigger conversation when we're saying, Spotify, you shouldn't even have him on here, because it's, again, like, that now you're going back to, like, is Spotify going to go rewrite their rules and say, if you're talking about things that people don't agree with, are we going to remove you? You know what I'm saying? And I think people get frustrated about change not happening, but when Joe Rogan can only be socially punished, right? He can't go to court and, like, unless someone, you know, like I guess it'd be a bigger process, but if he can only be socially punished, then the only people we should be frustrated at are the people that are still listening to him, the people that are still on Spotify, if that's what you want to be mad at. Like, those are the people that need to be coming together to, like, fix the problem, Because other than that, there really is nothing you can do to him.
He is a platform no matter what.
Yeah.
I think even if Spotify gets rid of him,
he keeps his listeners.
Because exactly, the people getting mad are not his platform.
Yeah.
Like,
people watch him on YouTube too, way more than Spotify.
And it's not us. Like, it's not necessarily people that are mad, upset right now, that are the ones listening to him. So, like, a better conversation would be, how do we mitigate for the consequences of what he's saying, rather than sitting here and talking about one man.
Yeah.
Because he's not the only person doing it either.
Yeah.
So, going back to Spotify's response to this whole canceling of Joe Rogan, I think they removed 60 or something episodes of his off of Spotify. And
did they really?
Yeah, they did.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
wow.
They after the whole artist thing, when a bunch of more artists started to boycott him by saying that they'll remove his music, they said they silently removed 60 or something episodes. Yeah. You can fact check that. It's a good number of his episodes.
Yeah.
Right?
Were they COVID related episodes?
I'm not sure. They might have just been controversial ones in the past and all that stuff. So that kind of reminds me of the whole thing that was going on with Twitter last year or maybe the year before that or something, when they started doing the disinformation isn't necessarily true, or exactly. Instagram. I don't know if it was Twitter or Instagram. I think it was both. But do you think that Spotify's response to the whole situation by removing his episodes was a good response, or do you think that it could have been a more a less direct response, kind of like Instagram or Twitter's, where they flag it but they keep it up? Well, it's kind of like respecting freedom of speech, but at the same time pointing the listeners towards the correct information.
I think that'd be a great idea to start flagging it on Spotify. I know Spotify, they responded at one point by saying Spotify's goal is to be a place where anyone can listen to anything. So they want everything to be accessible on there, I know is their goal. Whether that be music or podcasts or talk show specials or whatever. They want everything to be on there. And so with that in mind, it's hard, I guess, for them to just remove Joe Rogan's podcast. I think flagging things is a huge concrete thing that can be done to minimize the spread of misinformation.
I completely agree. I think they shouldn't remove it, because at the end of the day, and I think, again, this is something that I think we would be better off trying to accept in our generation. We don't want that information to go missing. We need to be hearing what is being said. I think you're missing a lot of the purpose of living in a democratic country and going through the process, whatever, when you're choosing to ignore 50% of this country. You know what I mean? I feel flagging it and making sure that there's a disclaimer, a system where every video, right, that might have slight information or whatever that scales that they decide has a little.
Yeah. So what if something
who gets to choose what might be misinformative,
what's acceptable
and what's acceptable.
What's not,
What if Google was anti-vaccine, so they started ruling quite a lot
that's the thing.
about how the vaccine works.
I mean, that's the process. What is legit?
I feel a lot of the times, though, corporations won't go against. If we're talking about specifically about COVID, I don't know one corporation that would go out of their way to try to deflect from what the government's saying. I don't know a corporation that would go against what the CDC is saying, because at the end of the day, they're 2 in 1. You know what I'm saying?
Corporations need the government to support them. What if the government are the people? So they're the ones that get to make a lot of the big decisions, right? And so I guess that's another thing. And we sort of talked about this before, but government has a lot of say as to what is socially acceptable and sort of builds the foundation of what we can and can't do. So, for example, if we're talking about, I don't know if ISIS considers themselves a government.
Yeah, they're a state.
They're a state. Okay, then there you go. That's a government right there.
They're a government.
And the U.S. government.
They call themselves a government.
Yeah, I mean they have the authority of a government. Yeah, but give or take, being recognized.
Not for the people, by the people.
Yeah.
But they consider themselves.
Depends who you are.
On who you ask,
okay.
But
Right, and
without, they definitely have authority. Yeah.
Yeah, without supporting ISIS, there's something to be said about just we have our set of things that we think are considered good. And I was thinking about this because have an interest in like what makes like evil people,
Mm-hmm.
and like it's hard to accept that people are just born evil. I feel like it just depends on how you were raised and the systematic structure of where you are. So people I know with ISIS at least are trained from like a young age, so that's sort of what they grow up on. And it's the same thing for us in a way. I don't know if all of you grew up in the U.S. I did, and so I grew up with more of an American mindset than say my family in Tunisia, who probably grew up with more of a Tunisian. It's slightly different when comparing to like ISIS, but it is still different. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but like
I think one of the things that we like, just to bring up like the good and evil part of it, is a lot of people don't really dig deeper into like what ISIS stands for and what they actually believe in. And I think, don't quote me, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure like you said, those kids, the people in ISIS were trained from a very young age, and I'm pretty sure they're the sons of the people who fought in Afghanistan. The Afghani people that fought like against the governments in Afghanistan, and they got exiled to Pakistan, and they were trained in Pakistan by I think like the rich religious leaders to go back to Afghanistan, that area, and try and take back their country, right? So when you think about it that way, they're doing it in the worst means possible, and they're killing innocent people and all these types of things, but they're also trying to take back the country that they think that was taken from them wrongfully. So like, how do we determine exactly what is good and what is evil? Like, if something happened here in the U.S., like you said, if somebody came and took our country from us, like, would we go back and fight for our country again? So it's just a big tangent, but that was just something I was thinking about. We never really think about like what the good, like what the mindset is of our enemies,
And I completely agree, but also like tying it back to misinformation, like I think there's things that we can, I guess it really is all subjective, but I feel like with COVID, as an example, like things that we call misinformation are outside of what like nationally recognized scientists are saying, right? But I think it gets a lot harder when you talk about terrorism or when you talk about terrorists, like people, or you talk about other countries, because going back to the government being what shapes what we think is good or bad, like he said, their perception of us is equally just as bad. And if they believe that they deserve to have their land back in any way, shape, or form, how do you even begin to call that misinformation? Does that make sense? And I feel like we've been fed misinformation about terrorists too. We've been fed misinformation about any kind of enemy that we see, like from a Western perspective, but also from a very American perspective. And I think like it goes back to I really feel like there's no way we'll ever get to something that we can like draw a line in the sand and say this is misinformation and this isn't, because it's biased. We have our biases.
We're only given one narrative. One narratives from many different people and every single different side, so it's like
but I think that like the ongoing fight between cancel culture and Twitter and society and our generation and the older generation, like anytime you see like two groups clashing, is like they're trying to build that line in the sand. And I think we'd be better off trying to make choices based on how little people get hurt. Does that make sense? Like I feel like if the misinformation about COVID is causing people to die, maybe let's pick the opposite of that. You know what I mean? If the misinformation is leading like people to have very strong opinions that lead them to violent actions, let's pick not using our platforms to push that motive. Or does that make I feel like make sense. That's the best way we can do it, but obviously again, even that is subjective.
So what about in like an authoritarian government? Let's say North Korea, right? If you took, and I want to draw this parallel here, because we're talking about Afghanistan, and in my understanding of it is that when the Taliban came around, they were saying that this is the truth, right? Everything else is not true, and they trained people in religious schools that said this is the way to think, this is what is right, this is what is wrong, and they just threw out education. There's no reading books. There was no free thought. It was this is this, and women were not allowed to educate themselves. That they hated that, because that was a threat to their government. They're saying, listen, we're getting rid of free thought. And I'm not saying that people should be able in the States to go out and spread misinformation. But I'm saying when you look at these authoritarian states, it's this is the truth. Mm-hmm. Anything else is false, and you should not listen to it, and this is the right way to think.
Yeah.
And that's how the Taliban, they had a huge radio program where this one guy would come on the radio and tell you what to think, what was going on, and you listen to that, and then they got rid of books, they got rid of everything.
Yeah, it's really horrible.
I mean, it's terrible because then everyone is forced to think that one way.
Absolutely. Like I can't imagine like the lives of people that live there, and I like never would pretend to understand. But I think what I'm saying is misinformation is like we're missing big chunks of that story from when that became what they thought, and then when they painted America as the villains of their story.
Sure.
And I think that like we kind of like obviously we can sit here and talk about all the bad that they do, but when we talk about it, the bad they do to us, there is misinformation. Like there is definitely a bias in the way that we're told that, because it's one thing. Human rights is a different conversation, obviously, but I'm talking about like the reasons that we hate them. I feel like the reasons that a good amount of Americans hate them have nothing to do with what they do to the people in Afghanistan or in the Middle East, but what they do to what they feel like they could do to us. And I think that's where you start having an enemy mindset rather than.
The media here doesn't even report on what they do in Afghanistan.
On what's
They
actually
don't.
going on.
They don't, and I feel like none of our actions in the Middle East, but specifically Afghanistan, have ever like related to women having education or women doing this.
We build schools. I mean, I definitely think we could have done it better, but I think a large part of our campaign there was trying to work with the locals to establish. Whether or not that was something they wanted, I know some of them did want it, was to establish a better system of government for them.
But I don't think it was out of the kindness. I don't think we woke up one day and said we really need to pick Afghanistan to fix. You know what I mean?
Well,
like I think
no.
That was
there's never a single clear motive for any conflicts that we get involved in. So.
Right. And I think that's what makes it like them and us. And I feel like that there's bias that like leads to misinformation that people then internalize and then react to in the world.
I think misinformation is a hugely like, as much as it is talked about, I feel like it's a hugely like underrated. Like, see what I'm saying by underrated?
Yeah.
100%.
Like a hugely significant problem that
100%.
we just like. I don't realize a lot of this stuff I'm talking about right now or anything, but just like it dictates so much of what we think and our decisions and just like at home, like we watch CNN, and so look at the CNN Fox debate in two completely different worlds, and just all the different sources you can use to get your information is just crazy. Like I don't like unless people, and you can't expect people to like check their source every single time and like recheck like 5 or 6 times to make sure that something is accurate. Because that's what you have to do really to make sure what you're hearing is true. You get the full stories. You have to look at.
I mean, you have to do your due diligence.
So now, if we're talking about like misinformation, and we're talking about like the news and all that, some people see social media as like the solution to combat misinformation, but we also are talking about how social media is also the worst thing.
People are saying social media is the best way to combat
misinformation.
How do you? What's the?
Because like with social media, you can find all different perspectives, and it's really easy for people to do the research to find
to
narrow down what the actual truth is, to find the best details about certain events, unlike with mainstream media like news like CNN and Fox News, where you're fed one narrative, and if you only watch that, like if you only watch CNN, or if a household only watches Fox, you're not going to be able to get the opposite side. Like with social media, there's so much misinformation, but it's also way easier to find the truth in a narrative rather than mainstream media. So now, like,
well, I think you're right. With the internet, there's so much information out there now, and some of it, like a small slice, is what I'm gonna say bad information.
Yeah.
But there's also so much good stuff. But you just need to
You need to have the common sense
Yeah,
and
and-
the rationality
yeah.
to
And the time,
dig
you got
through.
the
and the
Yeah,
time. I mean,
the
yeah,
time
to dig
yeah.
through.
And you gotta educate yourself on the whole spectrum. I don't think there's anything wrong with having that misinformation, that bad information.
Mm-hmm.
It's only bad when people see it and they latch onto it.
Yeah. So, like,
If you look at the whole spectrum, I think
Yeah.
you.
It seems like you
Seli,
disagree.
go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, okay, we have a couple minutes. I'm not going to talk for too long, but
Yeah.
there's so many things about you guys just said. First of all, I think journalism is an art. I think there are really talented journalists that genuinely do go out of their way, like to go to other places, whether it's domestically or internationally, to like try to find information and just present what happened, right? And then the context is what is the bias and the misinformation,
Based
all
on
that
what
kind
they're
of stuff.
seeing, like with
Right.
their own eyes.
And I think that it's not that I disagree that there's that social media has made the access to information easier and therefore allowing more people to have like the truth or at least start conversations so that different perspectives are being heard. I just don't think we're at a time in our generation or in society that we can throw away the news completely, because even though CNN does have bias and MSNBC has bias and Fox has bias, like there are still events, right? Like things that in moments of time that are happening and being captured that I think we would do well to consider, and then from there have those conversations and perspectives on social media. You can go on and say this is like, I just don't think anyone's walking around knowing what Congress was talking about for the past 7 hours today. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not trusting the girl that was at the party with me last weekend about what they were saying either.
Yeah.
So I think like there's a lot of news, BBC, Al Jazeera, like
NPR is usually
like right. So there's a lot of news sites that already exist that I think are doing a really, really good job at getting us the moment in time. And I think that social media would be better used if we could use it as a platform to have conversations rather than statements of truth, which is what you see a lot of times on Twitter, right?
So now, just as a counter example to that, what about like the whole? Let's just take 2020 for example.
Okay.
Like the events of 2020, all of the like the highly publicized, like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all that other things. Do you think that pre-social media events like those would have led to as big of an uproar and much change as like as like mainstream media and all that other stuff? Do you think that like
definitely
information like that would have been portrayed the same way?
Not at all. But I think the reason that social media made it more powerful is because one, that video, it gave it a platform, right, for the conversation to begin. But no one edited that video. We saw that video. No one can say that video is misinformation, right? And then it opened up. It gave us a platform for everybody else, the ones that aren't empowered, to have a conversation about what we were going to do about it. And that's what I'm saying. Like I think that's what makes social media powerful. But because there was a video, because we were able to like
it could have been out of context though. If we didn't see, because if we had just seen the video of Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck, I mean we could have no idea what happened before. Maybe he was like running around with a knife trying to stab people, and then maybe a knee is.
But I think George Floyd started the conversation of like, obviously, I think if that was the case, that would have been all over the media.
We had more
1000%.
videos to show us.
Yeah,
the
but
whole story,
even if we didn't, I think that would have been all over the media. But I think again, it's like, why is his knee even on his throat? Right? Like, why is he dying? Because even if you were running around with a knife or a gun at his school, you're getting arrested and sent to jail, right?
Sure.
And why was it different when it was
unless you're like posing harm on the
right,
so,
of course.
I see what you're saying.
And I think like, which is like, I think that even helps my points. I think what we saw for Black Lives Matter is like, for the first time, I think we were having a conversation amongst each other where we weren't getting fed the opinions of like, or the biases of like the people that are trying to, I guess, suppress us. But even that, I don't think it was misinformation. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that... I think they would have hid stuff, so thank God social media was there, but it doesn't change the fact that, like, when you go on TikTok, how many of what you're saying is... Like, how many truths that people say about working out or how you should eat or how you should... Like, right?
There's a lot of those accounts that are...
Exactly, that are saying things like, do this and then you'll get that. That's misinformation.
I mean, how many of those people are legitimate?
So, like, social media... So, we're coming up against what we're... basically summarizing is that social media presents way more misinformation than like mainstream media does, but at the same time it also allows us to like
because it brings us together, because there's a lot of people. There's too many.
I think social media is a great platform for conversation.
I think the internet has expanded our information, so then with that comes a lot of misinformation, but it's also expanded our common knowledge incredibly, and I think that's
well. Yeah. We do have to stop there, but thank you guys for coming on. This is really cool and interesting. First time doing it with this many people. But that was 3 Members of Closing the Gap. If anyone's interested in joining their club, they seem really cool. So yeah, thank you guys.
They are really cool.
Thank you for having us.